For more than 300 years, a whole series of powerful dynasties ruled from Delhi, and they completely changed the course of Indian history. We're talking about the Delhi Sultanate, an incredible era of, brutal conquest, but also radical innovation and a cultural fusion so deep you can still see its impact today. So we're going to unpack this whole complex and fascinating story, dynasty by dynasty.
Okay, so to really get a grip on these 300 years, you've got to know that the Sultanate wasn't just one long continuous empire. Nope, it was actually 5 very different dynasties, each with its own vibe. We kick things off with the Mamluks, the so-called slave dynasty, who really laid the groundwork. Then came the super ambitious and, let's be honest, ruthless Khaljis, who pushed the empire to its absolute peak. After them, you get the brilliant but kind of chaotic Tughlaqs, whose huge ideas almost tore the whole thing apart. Then you have the Sayyids, who kind of struggled to hold the pieces together. And finally, the Lodi dynasty, the first Afghan rulers, who were the last ones standing before a whole new power showed up on the scene.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at its pretty violent beginnings. Then we'll see how a fragile state was hammered into a real empire. We'll explore its absolute peak under 2 very, very different dynasties, chart its long, slow decline, and finally, really unpack the rich and complicated legacy it left for all the centuries that followed.
All right, so where does a story like this even begin? Well, it doesn't start the way you might think, with some royal prince inheriting a throne. Not at all. It starts with a series of bloody invasions from Central Asia and the unbelievable rise of a man who was, quite literally, someone else's property.
So, it all starts with the Ghurid dynasty, and specifically a guy named Sultan Muhammad Ghori. After his armies won a key battle, the heart of North India was basically his for the taking. But here's the thing. Ghori wasn't really interested in ruling from India. His focus was always back on his empire in what's now Afghanistan. So he left his new Indian lands in the hands of his most trusted general, a Turkish slave named Qutbuddin Aybak. Well, in 1206, Ghori gets assassinated, and Aybak, who's over in Lahore, suddenly has a big decision to make. Does he stay loyal to Ghori's successors, or does he claim this new territory for himself? He goes for it. He declares himself Sultan, and this was an absolutely brilliant strategic move. It basically cut off this new Indian kingdom from all the non-stop messy politics of Central Asia.
And this little detail here gives you a really key insight into Aybak. He wasn't just some warrior who grabbed a throne. Historians at the time called him Luckbakhsh because he was famous for his generosity. We're talking about giving away lakhs of coins to his soldiers and the elites. But listen, this wasn't just him being a nice guy. It was incredibly smart politics. Think about it. He's a former slave with 0 royal blood. His claim to the throne is shaky, to say the least. So by showering his followers with cash, he was buying the loyalty he desperately needed to hold together this brand new and very fragile kingdom. Okay, so you've got this new kingdom, founded by a former slave. How in the world does it get hammered into a real, consolidated empire? Well, it was a time of huge challenges. You had powerful rivals on the inside who thought they should be on the throne, and you had the terrifying shadow of the Mongols looming on the horizon.
Aybak's time on top was actually pretty short. He died in a freak polo accident. The man who takes over is Iltutmish, who was Aybak's own slave and son-in-law. You can see why they call him the slave of a slave. And it's Iltutmish who historians really see as the true architect of the Sultanate. He had huge problems to deal with right away. 2 of Ghori's other slaves also claimed to be the rightful rulers. Iltutmish had to defeat them both to make it clear he was the only one in charge. But his biggest test was a diplomatic one. You see, the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan himself were chasing this other king right to the edge of India. And Iltutmish made the incredibly wise decision to not offer that king any help. That little bit of calculated neutrality probably saved his young kingdom from being wiped out by the Mongols. And, most importantly, he's the one who moves the capital from Lahore to Delhi, a much more central and defensible spot that would become the heart of Indian power for centuries.
Now, to run a huge empire, you need more than just military might. You need some administrative genius. So how do you pay your generals and governors all across this massive territory when you don't have, a modern banking system? Iltutmish's answer was the Iqta system, and the idea was actually pretty brilliant. Instead of a cash salary, he'd grant nobles and commanders the right to collect taxes from a specific piece of land, an Iqta. These nobles, the muktis, would use that money to pay for themselves and their soldiers. Any extra cash, the fawazl, had to be sent back to the sultan's treasury. This system solved so many problems at once. It paid for the army, it handled administration in the provinces, and it brought local leaders into the imperial system. And what's really important here is that at this point, these land grants weren't hereditary. They could be transferred, which stopped any one noble from getting too comfortable and building their own little independent kingdom.
In what was a pretty incredible move for the 13th century, Iltutmish decided his sons were basically useless and nominated his very capable daughter, Razia, to be his successor. Just think about that. She became the first and only female Muslim ruler of the Delhi Sultanate, and Razia was a force to be reckoned with. She ditched the veil, wore men's clothes, and literally led her armies from the front, on horseback. But she faced massive opposition from this powerful group of Turkish nobles called the Çahalgani, or the 40. These were the top slave generals that Iltutmish himself had promoted, and they saw themselves as the real kingmakers. They were not about to take orders from a woman. Things really came to a head when she promoted an Abyssinian slave, Jamal-ad-Din Yakut, to a high-ranking position, which directly challenged their power. They revolted, and Razia's incredible 4-year reign came to an end in defeat and ultimately her death.
So this decades-long power struggle between the Sultan on one side and the Turkish nobles on the other finally boils over with the rise of Ghiyasuddin Balban. Now, Balban was a shrewd and absolutely ruthless politician who was, get this, one of the Çahalgani himself. He'd been the real power behind the throne for years, so when he finally became Sultan, he knew exactly how dangerous this council of nobles was to the monarchy. He was determined to crush their power and make the Sultan an absolute, almost godlike figure, and his strategy for doing this became famously known as the policy of blood and iron.
And Balban's approach was just methodical and total. The very first thing he did was completely dismantle the Chalisa, the group of nobles he came from. He basically had the most powerful members either assassinated or exiled. Then he brought in these elaborate Persian court rituals, like sajada, which meant you had to completely prostrate yourself before him, and paibas, where you had to kiss his feet. I mean, this was psychological warfare. It was designed to humiliate these proud Turkish nobles and drill it into their heads that the Sultan was not their equal, he was their absolute master. To make sure his rules were followed, he set up this huge network of spies who reported directly to him on everybody, including his own sons. And finally, he beefed up the central military, the Diwaniyars, to make sure the army was loyal to the throne, not to individual nobles. For Balban, the Sultan's power had to be absolute, it had to be unquestioned, and it had to be terrifying.
Okay, so the Mamluks had built an empire. Now, under the next two dynasties, the Khaljis and the Tughlaqs, the Sultanate is going to hit its absolute peak. This is a period of just massive expansion, really radical economic experiments, and these huge, ambitious projects that would either take the empire to heights it had never seen before or bring it right to the edge of total collapse.
Alauddin Khalji, who got the throne by murdering his own uncle, was just a military machine. His entire reign was basically defined by two things: defending India from the Mongols and expanding his own empire. He managed to fight off a whole series of huge Mongol invasions, saving North India from the kind of destruction that had leveled Central Asia and Persia. At the same time, he was just a relentless conqueror. He took the legendary Rajput forts of Ranthambore and Chittor, but his biggest dream was to conquer the south. So he sent his genius general Malik Kafur on these incredibly daring raids deep into the Deccan, bringing back just unbelievable amounts of gold and jewels. Now, to do all this, Alauddin built a massive, centrally paid army, the biggest the Sultanate had ever had. But that created a giant economic headache. How on earth do you pay for it all?
His military obsession led to one of the most incredible economic experiments in medieval history. The logic was actually pretty simple. If you want to afford a giant army, you got to pay them. And to keep their salaries from bankrupting you, you have to make sure the cost of living is dirt cheap. So Alauddin introduced a system of total price control. He literally fixed the price of everything essential: grain, cloth, horses, cattle, even slaves. To make sure there was enough grain to go around, he set up huge state granaries and forced peasants to sell their extra crops to the government at a fixed price. Then he created this new layer of bureaucracy, the Shana-e-Imandi, or market superintendents, who, along with a network of spies, would brutally punish anyone caught hoarding or price gouging. I mean, this was basically a 14th century command economy, and it worked. It let him pay his soldiers a modest cash salary that still gave them a decent life, which is how he kept his war machine running.
So after the practical, ruthless Khaljis, you get the Tughlaqs, led by one of the most brilliant, complex, and ultimately tragic figures in the Sultanate's entire history, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. This guy was an intellectual giant, a scholar of philosophy, logic, mathematics. His mind was just buzzing with visionary ideas that were way ahead of his time. But his reign became a textbook example of good ideas, terrible execution. It was just one spectacular failure after another.
And this slide here lays out his two most famous disasters. First, moving the capital. On paper, the idea was solid: shift the capital from Delhi down to Daulatabad in the center of the country to better control the south. but the execution was a total nightmare. He didn't just move his government, he forced the entire population of Delhi, everybody, to march 700 miles south. So many people died on the way. The new capital didn't work out, and within a few years he had to order a humiliating retreat back to Delhi. Then there was his token currency. He saw that China was using paper money and that there was a global silver shortage, so he decided to issue bronze and copper coins that would have the same value as silver coins. Brilliant, right? Except he made one fatal mistake. He didn't make the government the only ones who could mint the coins. Soon, every blacksmith in the kingdom was making counterfeit coins in their backyard. The economy was flooded with fakes, foreign traders refused to accept the money, and the whole system just collapsed into chaos.
And you know, those weren't his only mistakes. He tried to raise taxes in a fertile region right when a terrible famine hit, which led to massive peasant revolts. He spent a fortune building a huge army for a year to invade Central Asia, and then just abandoned the whole project. Every single one of these failures just drained the treasury and destroyed his authority. This famous quote from the historian Badauni, written when the Sultan finally died, just perfectly captures how everyone felt. The king was freed from his people, and they from their king. His reign, so full of big ideas that were so poorly executed, had caused so much chaos and fatally weakened the empire, starting it on its long, slow decline.
The damage was really done. So next up, we're going to see how this once unstoppable empire, stretched to its absolute limit and rocked by all these failures, began its long, slow unraveling over the next century and a half.
The decline really was a slow burn, but it was punctuated by one absolutely catastrophic event. Muhammad's successor, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, was more focused on public works, building canals, hospitals, things like that. But in an effort to keep the nobles happy, he made a huge mistake. He made the Iqta land grants hereditary. This completely reversed the original point of the system. Now noble families could treat their lands like their own personal kingdoms, which shattered the Sultan's central control. And then in 1398 came the hammer blow. The Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur, you might know him as Tamerlane, invaded India and just brutally sacked Delhi. He massacred the population and hauled away an unbelievable amount of treasure. The Sultanate never ever recovered from that. It just shattered, with different provinces declaring they were independent. The next dynasty, the Sayyids, were a joke. They barely controlled Delhi itself. Then the Lodis, an Afghan dynasty, managed to get some power back, but they were constantly fighting among themselves because of this idea that the king was just the first among equals, which meant non-stop rebellion.
And the end came because of all this internal fighting. A powerful governor in Punjab named Tughlaq Khan Lodi got fed up with the Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, so he made a decision that would change history. He invited another ruler from Central Asia, a guy named Babur, who just happened to be a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, to come help him overthrow the Sultan. Babur said yes, but he wasn't coming to help. He was coming to conquer. So in 1526, at the First Battle of Panipat, Babur's small, disciplined army, armed with new tech like cannons and muskets, went up against Ibrahim Lodi's huge but old-fashioned force. Babur's superior tactics completely smashed the Lodi army. Ibrahim Lodi was killed on the battlefield, and just like that, 320 years of the Delhi Sultanate came to a sudden end. This cleared the way for a brand new power, the Mughal Empire.
So the Sultanate was over, but its 300-year reign had totally transformed the Indian subcontinent. So the question is, what was its lasting impact? What did it really leave behind?
Well, one of its longest-lasting legacies was in administration. The sultans created this really systematic way of governing that had a clear chain of command, from the capital right down to the villages. The empire was divided into provinces, or Iqtas. Those were divided into districts, or shiks, and those were broken down even further into parganas. At the very bottom, you had the village, run by traditional headmen. This whole structure was so logical and effective that later rulers like Sher Shah Suri and the Mughals basically just adopted it and tweaked it. You can see its influence on the map of the subcontinent for centuries to come.
But maybe the most visible legacy was this incredible new cultural fusion. Take architecture. The Turks brought in elements from Persia and Central Asia like the true arch and the dome. And when you combine that with the amazing skills of Indian builders, you get this unique Indo-Islamic style that you see in masterpieces like the Qutb Minar. Or look at music. The Sultanate's court, especially with geniuses like Amir Khusrau around, saw the birth of new music like qawwali and the development of instruments like the sitar and tabla. Persian became the official language of government and literature, but at the same time it was mixing with local languages to create new ones. And the Sultanate also popularized some key technologies, like paper, which changed record-keeping forever, the spinning wheel, which supercharged textile production, and the Persian wheel, which made irrigation so much more efficient.
So in the end, you're left with this really fascinating paradox, right? The Delhi Sultanate starts with incredible violence and conquest. Its history is filled with ruthless leaders and brutal wars. And yet, over those 3 centuries, it also became this amazing place of administrative innovation and cultural blending that profoundly shaped the identity of the Indian subcontinent. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful question to think about. How did an empire that was born from conquest end up leaving a legacy of art, administration, and culture that still echoes today?